When I moved to Gainesville for the start of undergrad, I specifically remember the first thing that I did after my parents helped me unpack my dorm and left. I pulled out my laptop and I played one of my favorite J. Cole songs. And what you need to know about J. Cole, other than the fact that he's the greatest rapper ever, you're not changing my mind. I'm sorry, is the fact that a fair amount of his music explores the relationship between space and place. He's from Fayetteville, North Carolina, the Ville, as he dubs it. And my connection to his music, strengthened by the fact that I spent a significant portion of my life in North Carolina, was deepened when I moved here to my Ville, Gainesville. But my journey to Gainesville doesn't start with me. It starts with what I consider to be the deepest and strongest part of my roots, which is my family. My family hails from the island nation of Haiti, or Haiti. And their story of coming to the States provides perspective to so many like them. I've witnessed firsthand as members of my family and my community struggled to find and cultivate spaces of culture and heritage. I've heard countless stories from my parents, albeit not at all unique to them, about the struggle of having to start over from scratch financially in a new country. And I've witnessed as my family was able to achieve an American dream held by many but remains elusive to that much many more, which is the opportunity to build wealth through home ownership. And to that end, I've seen so many people who have struggled under the weight of houselessness and housing insecurity. Many who struggle a lot because of circumstances largely out of their control. But I've also seen what happens when these individuals are given the space and opportunity to advocate for themselves. I know that advocacy works because I've seen it in my own work, supporting and uplifting some of the most marginalized members of our society. I've had the honor and privilege of working alongside organizations like the Miami Worker Center as they assisted tenants who were struggling against a landlord who attempted to raise their rent in 1 month by 65%. Because of their efforts, Hialeah City Council passed an ordinance that mandated landlords to provide 60 days notice prior to any rental increase above 10%. In 1 week, this was strengthened at the county level, and Miami-Dade County passed an ordinance that mandated that landlords were required to provide 60 days notice prior to any rental increase above 5%. And this is applicable to the entire county, including Hialeah. Now, the people that advocated for this weren't career politicians that were just angling for votes. These were working class people who mirrored a lot of what my family looked like when we first moved here. Folk who had dreams that may, on the face, first blush, seem innocuous, but due to how our society treats marginalized voices seems bold. Dreams of being treated fairly and justly and not being excluded out of the legislative process. And the reality that the law is supposed to affirm the hopes and dreams and realities of the people. And one of the first and best ways that we can do this is by making sure that housing is attainable for everyone. Affordable housing is democratic housing. But opponents of this might just say this is just purely an instance of market forces and shrug and wash their hands of the situation and call it a day. But I'd be remiss to not even acknowledge that a lot of the victims of this displacement are ethnic and racial minorities. A lot of the beneficiaries of secure housing would be ethnic and racial minorities. And moreover, there is a common theme. There's a strong correlation between housing security and upward mobility for all people. But these opponents instead work to expand and create laws that benefit landlords at the expense of renters. And this creates an instance of displacement. And I want to be clear that any act that removes an individual forcibly from their home without a place to go is an act of displacement. More importantly, displacement is an act of violence. And the victims of this violence happen to be disproportionately folk who are ethnic and racial minorities, folk who are differently able, folk who may have a different immigration status. And this violence shows up in one of three ways, commonly. First, standard evictions that are filed through the courts. Second, invisible evictions in which landlords will harass tenants with notices, legal or illegal, bother them, pepper them with visits to their home in hopes that the tenants will leave on their own accord. And third is an illegal lockout in which a landlord will illegally change the locks on the unit in order to keep them out from their residence. And as a result, in Florida alone, tens of thousands of individuals were subject to formal evictions, and it's estimated that thousands more were subject to these illegal practices. And like I said before, a disproportionate amount of individuals who experience this are racial and ethnic minorities. And that is due in large part to this country's relationship with race. From the policy of redlining, the policy and practice of withholding investment to areas deemed to be, quote, high risk due to an individual's race and ethnic background, to the construction of the racial caste systems that undergirded the premature conclusion of Reconstruction and Jim Crow and the interlocking systems of oppression that we experience now. The United States hasn't just acquainted itself well with exclusionary policies and practices. For much of its history, it's been a leader, so much so that other countries have either paralleled or looked to the United States for advice in the construction, advice in the construction of their own racial caste systems. Most commonly, or most famously, the institution of apartheid in South Africa in the 20th century. At the conclusion of World War II, Black South Africans watched as their wealth and their culture was extracted from their communities. And much of this included wealth in land and housing. And while South Africa still has a long way to go, even after one of the most audacious expansions of civil and human rights in human history, so do we. What Black South Africans understood and what our country still contends with today is the notion that the law is merely a reflection of the morals and values of the people. That we are the witnesses to displacement and violence, and in fact, the law is just a mirror being held up to us. And it is showing us who we are, and better yet, it is challenging us to ask ourselves, who do we want to be? Displacement and violence that even J. Cole himself and his family experienced. J. Cole's, what many consider to be his magnum opus, 2014 Forest Hills Drive. In my opinion, it is not, but they're not asking me. He details from ages 11 to 18, living at 2014 Forest Hills Drive. And upon turning 18 and going to college, his mother being subject to foreclosure on that childhood home. Now, as an adult, successful entertainer, he was able to buy back that home and pledged it that the home would be used to make sure that mothers who were struggling under the weight of housing insecurity and houselessness wouldn't have to go through that anymore. And while his philanthropy isn't subject or a good replacement for good policy like what we saw in Miami, his act of philanthropy is what our minds and our hearts should be attuned to. Which brings me back to when I moved to here for undergrad. See, when I moved to Gainesville for undergrad, I lived in a relatively affordable apartment complex at the time, for most of my time in undergrad. But as I've come to understand it, things are different now. And while I was just an 18-year-old kid with no beard, no beard, The problem isn't just unique to 18-year-olds anymore. It's grad students who can't afford while studying full-time and working full-time. It's working class individuals, folk who make $40,000 and folk who make six figures, all struggling under the same weight that my family struggled under over almost 30 years ago. And all of us, irrespective of our station in life, are looking to the same law, looking at the same mirror. And that mirror is asking us, who are we? And more importantly, who do we want to be? Thank you.